Great, so without further ado, Dara.
Hi. So I'm going to do something a little more casual and relaxed with you, in that I want to talk about, use a case study for my entrance into this conversation about vigilante justice. In the program, it might say vigilante culture. I sort of move back and forth between what notions and concepts I'm working on. And for this presentation, I'm going to be talking to you about 419 scams, Nigerian 419 scams, as a case study to get into an idea that I'm working through about Vigilantism and parallel justice, this idea of servicing victims online and really being there as the champion of the online victims. I'm rethinking ideas about vigilante justice. I've written a paper last year on Vigilantism and lynching as an icon of what vigilantes are interested in. But now I'm sort of moving in this direction of symbolic storytelling and play culture, starting to look at game theory and things like that, because of how communities online publics are thinking about the laws, vernacular justice, what it means to build laws online when there is no real due process in a global sense. And I've also been playing with architectural concepts in terms of how we build things, how communities, publics really build things. So this discussion is going to at first focus on the rhetorical performance of justice and punishment online, and I'm using a 419 scams as a case study to explain more about my thinking of Digilantism. And Digilantism refers to what I see as a growing practice amongst internet users, mostly based in the United States and the United Kingdom, who mete out extrajudicial punishment to cyber criminals. Although it is a growing internet subculture, I'd say that it's largely underrepresented in the scholarship. The bulk of the literature at the time that I started writing about Vigilantism, the bulk of the articles that I found were really through journalists. And I actually really appreciate the journalist coverage of how scammers, particularly scammers, victims, and those who were championing the victims' causes, that are getting that sort of discussion out there into the public, because it was sort of missing from the academic voice. So to address that gap, I started to look at or make sense of artifacts that I had been collecting for a number of years. I used to say that I was someone who looked at only really weird things online, but I think that in terms of what I like to look at, this audience here will really appreciate it, and I probably am not so weird after all, because I noticed in terms of the topics that people are looking at really interesting discussions online. So I really hope to get some feedback on these ideas that I'm working through. I'm sure many of you have received something like this in your Hotmail account, your Yahoo account, that you may casually refer to as the Nigerian email. And this is the email that says that if you help me out, I will transfer $40 million into your account. Refers to, is also known as a 419 scam if you're in the world of justice interests. And the 419 scam refers to what how law enforcement agencies describe this in reference to an article in the Nigerian Criminal Code for confidence schemes. In addition to using this term from the Nigerian Criminal Code, it's important to know that there has been an ongoing discussion since at least the mid-90s about what to do about Nigeria and scams in Nigeria and fraud in Nigeria and how it impacts Western states, particularly the US and the United Kingdom. So ongoing attention by government and corporate agencies in relation to corruption issues, the impact of the underperforming oil industry and the like. In 2011, for example, the Transparency International reported that Nigeria ranked 143rd out of 182 countries after assessing fraud in its public sector. Though Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer and the world's ninth, it also receives $16 billion in subsidies to import oil. A 2012 report by the Nigeria's Economic and Financial Crimes Commission determined that $6.8 billion of these subsidies could be attributed to fraud. Likewise, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated that Nigerian officials siphoned approximately $400 billion out of the oil industry between 1960 and 1999. These kinds of conversations about the fraud crime problem in Nigeria, because of its connection to the US and the UK, of course meant that we were all receiving this conversation about all that is wrong and corrupt in the country. The international media coverage about the country's turmoil, especially under the Abacha regime, along with allegations of human rights violations, was fairly widespread and well known. So in 1999, it wasn't unusual to receive an email from a government official who was once affiliated with the Abacha regime claiming to have access to his secret treasures. This would have been believable at that time because news coverage attended to that. A couple of years ago, it was pretty common for me to receive in my Hotmail account, I have to love that Hotmail account, a message from a military official connected to Iraq who had access to Saddam Hussein's secret billions. And it's things like that that make a confidence scheme work, because it would be plausible in our global context and our global understanding of what is happening in some of these countries. But the research shows that despite the development of a number of specialized agencies, it's been largely impossible in the United States and overseas to impact advance fee fraud. The legal recourse around this is lengthy, and it's well known that once you lose money this way, you're just not ever going to see it again. And this gives the justification for what Digilantes claim to do. So by the late 90s, while online life was thriving, so too were opportunities for criminal pursuits. There are a couple of things that lend some more context to the Digilante efforts that I want to discuss. For one, we must look at the way that Nigeria became an identified category in itself in fraud reporting. For example, the National Consumers League, National Fraud Information Center, in 1996, they started talking about how online fraud was on the rise. By 1997, they had a category that identified advance fee fraud. The following year, around 99-2000, Nigerian fraud was its own category, in addition to advance fee fraud. Likewise, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, which is a combination of the National White Collar Crime Center and the FBI, they also were doing similar kind of reporting. So you have a consumer league and an official US government agency that were also distinguishing between fraud and Nigerian specific fraud. At that time, they noted that, IC3 noted that about 50,000, of 50,000 complaints that they received in around 2000, 1/3 of them were coming from people who were saying that they had experienced some type of fraud related to Nigeria. By 2001, they attributed the dollar loss to about $17.8 million. That would be a median dollar loss of $435 per complaint. By 2002, just 1 year later, that number had swelled to about $54 million in losses. By 2006, the Department of Justice claimed that 2.8 million victims of online schemes, including 419 activity, had been accounted for, estimating about $1 billion worth of losses. Now, this is starkly different from popular perception of advanced fee fraud, because when you get one of those emails in your mailbox, you laugh and you probably say, who believes this? Who actually sends their money? In fact, when you read some of the articles reported by in some of the newspapers, why would you send $10,000 to somebody you've never met or you don't know? And therein lies an additional issue, that people who have been impacted by these crimes are even more reluctant to come forward because of the shame and the treatment that they receive. I did a random sampling of articles, and it wasn't uncommon to find that writers often attributed 419 fraud, the victims, as being silly or greedy in falling for these obvious schemes. In fact, victims who've been reluctant to come forward in some cases have gone to Nigeria in an effort to get their money back, or in a handful of cases have hanged themselves, set themselves on fire, or shot others upon realizing that they had been schemed. And so we have this. For the people who are on live stream, my images are going to be very different from what you see. Part of the reason for that is I was at a conference, I did a presentation 2 months ago, and somebody asked me about whether I was re-victimizing the people in these images by sharing them and so on. And that kind of question, the person who asked the question was someone I taught in undergrad, so I was very proud of the question, but now that she's a doctoral student, I was like, ooh, now I have to really think about that. And in thinking about it, when the issue of live streaming came up, since I wasn't settled, I opted not to put the images online because I really just, I am not sure where I am right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why the conditions that I mentioned before make this such that it's ripe for conditions of Digilantism. 419 Vigilantes frequently cite crime data, the lack of swift legal action, corruption in Nigeria, and select victim narratives to explain their participation in scam baiting. This is a practice that started gaining popularity around 2002, and it's actually best described when you set it against the backdrop of post-9/11 anti-terror measures, increased demands for border security, transnationally inflected rhetorics of immigration reform, the easy passage of stand your ground, self-defense bills, neo-Nazi movements and skinhead movements in the UK, and of course, Minutemen-like militia groups throughout the United States. Though rarely cast alongside Vigilantism, Vigilante zeal is quite similar, as I will show you today, in that it hinges on the belief that there are scarcities in the state security system. In fact, what Vigilantism and Digilantism is about is filling that gap when people do not believe that the state can protect them any longer. But Digilantism, 419 Digilantism is particularly unique because the scammers, in this case, the scam baiters, the Digilantes, are focusing on a crime that by all reports does not actually take place in Nigeria. The bulk of the criminals are spread in networks throughout the western states. However, they focus on ideas or imagery about folks who are in Nigeria. So the images that you're going to be looking at are examples of trophies that I would say help to contextualize what I found when I started focusing on Digilantism. Taken from the trophy room on 419eater.com, these represent what scam baiters think of as appropriate applications of justice and punishment. You will notice a particular theme that I argue and talk about in my writing as an anti-black vigilantism. And anti-black vigilantism is very specific because we start to get into things about lynching. And so I look at lynching as this sort of icon of what it means to punish the body. In my work, I question whether Digilantism can function as a voice for the victims? Can you really talk about protecting victims when you don't actually represent a unified victim voice? It's not exactly hard work to argue about the parallels between this kind of Digilantism and lynching iconography. The question is why? In the work that I've been doing, I've started to rethink issues about play culture, symbolic storytelling, and the pleasure that we get from punishing the body. Particularly thinking about the free activity, playing as a free activity, that these trophies tell a story of fantasy and play in a racial form. What does it mean to be in a rule government environment? You have to learn how to play these rules quickly and also get some kind of prize or trophy as a result. These groups take a lot of pleasure out of the everyday, and so I wonder, when we think of vernacular notions of justice, when we get together to build laws, societies, justice, a sense of what it means to do right or wrong, when we do this in a digital environment where punishing the body is rhetorical, we don't actually harm someone, how does that replicate these Western notions of punishment of the flesh in the vigilante form? I'm out of time, but I would be happy to have this conversation after this session is over, because I have a lot of ideas here that I did not pay much attention to the time in getting to what I really wanted to talk about. Okay.
Just make sure to, I'll flash you in. Okay. So just make sure to be flashing.
All right, great. So I'm Laura Noreen. This project comes out of some work that I did at Microsoft Research a couple of summers ago as a doctoral intern, and it's about food blogs and food blogging. And I take a look at a very specific case of the food blogging enclave to see how rewards flow through the community and what counts as a reward. Is it a community thing? Is there something about affective economies? Or is it also about income and generating income by blogging or getting book contracts and that kind of thing? So my research questions are, for this one in particular, about how the elements of blogging practice, the writing and photography, the linking and commenting that goes on with blogging, and traditional publishing, as well as attending conferences, intersect with socioeconomic class. And it looks specifically at how rewards are distributed. And just for those of you who may not be that familiar with food blogging, we'll give you a little bit of background. So food has been something that has talked about on the internet since before the internet really made it out of DARPA. Some of the early employees were reprimanded for exchanging recipes on what was at the time a relatively fragile and expensive network. And now Google has more than 10 million recipe searches every day, which is a real underestimate of how much food is happening online, because a lot of people go directly to Epicurious or to All Recipes, and they bypass Google altogether. Bloggers are hoping to get as much of that traffic as they can, and there's ongoing fights about how Google indexes recipes, and I won't get into that too much, but it is notable that Google specifically has representatives who go out to food blogging communities and go to these conferences to try to figure out what food bloggers are doing, what they want, what works for them. So the key concepts that I'm looking at are community support and income and material rewards, and how those kind of intersect and influence each other. And I'm going to be showing you kind of what food blogging is like. All the images in the presentation are taken from different food blogs. None of the food blogs repeat. Hopefully you'll agree with me that the quality of the photography is relatively high. A lot of the conferences are sessions on how to take better food photography, how to do lighting. You might have to take your cake up to your bathroom if that's where the light in your house is the best, and photograph it there. And you might have to buy sort of big light boxes. There's sort of do-it-yourself, how do you make a light box? And so it's relatively professionalized. blogging enclave. So to help sort of set some of the terms before I start using them, I'm using Sarah Ahmed's definition of affective economies. And they are, she's talking about emotions not being simply within or without, but that they circulate, and that seeing emotions as a psychological disposition, rather than seeing them as psychological dispositions, we need to consider how they work in concrete and particular ways to mediate the relationship between the psychic and the social, and between the individual and the collective. So in food blogging, it's really not about, it's really about how those emotions are circulating, not about where they reside in particular individuals. And I'm using also a concept that is pretty common in networking, social network systems and theory, and I'm borrowing directly from economists here to look at the market structure of food blogging, because I am interested in things like income. So kind of qualities that you need if you're looking to have a winner-take-all market structure is that relative differences need to be dramatically over-rewarded. So I may not have a blueberry muffin recipe that is 10 times better than yours, but if it's just a little bit better than yours, everyone will go to my blueberry muffin recipe and no one will ever go to yours, even if it's just a tiny bit better. Like that photograph is just a little more scrumptious. Everyone will appear at my blog and not yours. So that's one quality that we need. And the other quality that we need is that all of the top performers, it's not like I might one day have a better blueberry muffin recipe and the next day you have a better chocolate cake recipe, and so the relative rewards are kind of randomly distributed throughout, but that all of them kind of concentrate in these top performers. And so the question for food blogs is, how much are these rewards really going to recipe quality? Are they going to photography? Are they going to writing? What is it that's getting rewarded? Is it about, specific things about blogging, like liking lots of things or commenting on other blogs? Exactly where do these rewards, kind of what gets rewarded? What's good to do in food blogging? So the problem with winner take all, why would that even be a problem? Is that if you have a winner take all market, it tends to, or at least if you're an economist, you're worried that it attracts too much talent. So you get too many people trying to food blog because they all think they're going to write, a best-selling New York Times blog to book situation, and they don't. And so then you might have a lot of people who are kind of wasting their time food blogging. And this is where I was really interested in this, because I'm not sure that that's why food bloggers are really blogging. Are they interested in publishing books, or are they really in it for those affective rewards? Like, I really want to feel support from the food blogging community, and 83% of the people who do food blogs say that they're in it for the community. So if that's true, does this winner take all, is that even a problem, and can it be applied to affective rewards? So this is a quick diversion to methods. If you're a sociologist, you'll love this part. If you're not, it'll probably be a little boring. It's a little difficult to study food blogs because they're not located in any particular place. They all have their own domains. There are food blogging aggregators, but not everyone uses them. So the first thing that I tried to do was discover all of the food blogs. Thought was very ambitious. And I used a web crawler, so I seeded the crawler with, okay, here are 59 known food blogs. Go to them, pull off all the links that they are linking to, assuming that they're linking to some other food blogs. Go to those to those other links, test them against a food word dictionary. So luckily food words are nice in the sense that when you say artichoke, you only mean artichoke. When you say asparagus, you only mean asparagus. So you can pretty well actually weed out all the websites that they link to that are not food websites. So that was great. It was awesome. I was very happy about that. Send off this bot and go find all the food websites. The problem is there's a lot of food websites that are not blogs. And it was really difficult to weed out everything that wasn't a blog. I thought bloggers would use words like I and me and pretty and really and things that maybe journalists wouldn't use. But that did not work out. So I ended up having to sort of hand go through the ones that I ended up surveying to make sure they were in fact food blogs. And the whole reason I did that was so that I could distribute surveys to a random assortment of blogs rather than to just top bloggers. So from the 30,000-ish, it was actually more like 35,000 hits that the web crawler got, I sent out surveys to about 800 bloggers. Some of them didn't, in fact, receive the survey because of spam problems, but I did get 300 responses, and then I interviewed 30 food bloggers as well. So this is what the web crawler did. It ran for 3 months, and it did not reach the end of the food blogging network. So there are far more than 35,000 food blogs out there, probably, but I could not tell you how many there are. And it added roughly, say, 60 to 70 new nodes per hour, with some kind of gaps when it was hitting things that weren't very food bloggy, and or times when the internet was down, sad times. So once I had those people, I could survey them. As probably you're not too surprised, most food bloggers are women, 84%-ish, and that's been replicated by others. But they're not the kind of stereotypical stay-at-home moms with kids. A, they don't really stay at home. Most of them are professionals working. B, 70% of them do not have children, and only about half are married. So part of that is an age situation. The most of them are in the 25 to 39 age range. So they may not have yet had a chance to get married or have kids. But the thing that I really want to draw your attention to the most is, yes, that they do not have kids. These aren't moms for the most part. And they're extremely well educated. So this becomes important later. More than 70% of them have completed their bachelor's and or master's and or PhD. So this is a very, very well educated group, and that is what sets it apart from the rest of sort of population as a whole. Is the gender domination by women, and then the fact that they're extremely well educated. And I don't have an image for this, but if you are keeping track of demographics, 74% of them were white, 15% were Asian American, 2.3% were mixed race, only 4% were Hispanic or Latino, and only 1% were African American. So very underrepresented in terms of underrepresented minorities were extremely underrepresented here as well. So that's who they are. So this is kind of what they're doing. Now bear with me, I'm gonna have to explain this graphic a little bit. So food bloggers don't always post exactly the same thing in every post. So I asked them, like, roughly how often do you include the following kinds of content in your posts? So almost always you'll see that big blue block over there is 74% of the time they include images. That is the single number one thing that it takes to be a good food blogger, is to always post images. Only 37% of the time, or only 37% of the people were posting recipes 80 to 100% of the time. So you would think maybe this is about recipes, but it's not. It's really about pictures. And there are also distinctions between recipe bloggers and review bloggers. So a lot of people never post reviews, or very rarely post reviews of restaurants. And the things that food blogging is not about, it's not about nutrition. These people are not fixated on nutrition. That's not what it's about. Almost nobody was using videos at that time, and it wasn't really cool to post non-food content. So these are not people who are then also posting about their children. So I found that there were sort of three types of bloggers. There's amateur bloggers who don't want to make money, and then there are two types of bloggers who want to make money. The commercial bloggers probably want ad revenue, and the professional bloggers would really like to use their blog not to make money directly, but to get book contracts or freelancing writing and photography contracts. I want to read you a few little things from the interviews just to get a flavor of how the kind of norms of commercial and professional blogging filter down to shape what amateurs can do and how much effective reward they're going to get. So Kate is a Boston-based food blogger who at the time had just started her blog, and she was hoping to get a job as a journalist, which she eventually did, but she didn't have it at this time. So she said, a good blog, in her words, would be using a journalistic style in a way that you are crediting your source and really investigating the things that you are writing. That is the kind of blog you aspire to, always. She cringed when she recalled reading through the ones that are like, I, me, a statement repeated by Kel, another Boston blogger who wrote restaurant reviews with her college classmate. She said, a lot of the other ones are like, I had this, and I did this, and I. It's so boring. We are not writing about ourselves. We are writing about the food. And that sort of sentiment, like, if you're using this as a diary, you're doing it wrong. Stop talking about yourself. That is very much, what the professional bloggers were after. And the commercial bloggers were a little different. They weren't fixated as much on what other people were doing. So so this was my top earning blogger. She says, it's very financially rewarding for me. I mean, truthfully, I would have never been able to retire if I wasn't making any money from my blog. But now with my blog and my pension, truly, I have more money than I have ever had in my life. So she goes on and she says, her blogging is a full-time job. She probably works 50 to 60 hours a week. She hired an assistant to help her, and she spends at least 3 or 4 hours a day just commenting, answering emails, and posting something. And the way that works then, so another blogger who's really skeptical of this, she wrote me an email and explained how commenting networks set up. She said it's a type of circling of the wagons and then engaging in an organized, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. Apologies, I can't think of a more eloquent way to describe it at the moment. But a person contacts others, chosen specifically for what each can add to the group. The audience for each blog becomes accessible to the group. The agreement is about supporting and promoting one another's blogs on social media. For example, perhaps I've noticed I'm not getting much traffic on a post. I can email the others and ask them to promote it however they wish. Grossly uncomfortable. I don't have to look like I'm wallowing in self-aggrandizement because my group members are taking care of me. And she got that email and she then quit food blogging because she found that disgusting. So what is the problem with these markets? So some people find that it's problematic that only about 1% of the bloggers make $1,000 or more. Everyone else is making basically less than $5. So there's this huge, the 99%, 1% thing, it sets up here in terms of income pretty well. But that wasn't as much a problem for me, because there are very few people who are going to repeat this. So this is one of the top, probably, food bloggers in the United States. She has 2 book contracts. Her first book contract went on to be a New York Times bestseller, or her first book, and this is probably the top recipe blogger. She also was a New York Times bestseller. So it is possible to really make it big in food blogging. I'm sure we'd all love to be New York Times bestsellers one day. But the problem for me isn't so much, right? Isn't so much about that, because I think that's relatively not what these people are looking for. Most of them don't care about that. But they do care that they really have no access to these affective rewards. If you're not a top blogger, no one comes to your blog to leave comments, because if I leave a comment on a top blogger's blog, I know that blogger gets lots of traffic, and more of that traffic is going to flow to my blog because people will click on my comment to come see where I am. Whereas if I leave a comment on a not well-read blog, nobody's ever going to see it because nobody's reading that blog. So it's the Matthew effect, where the people who have the most get the most. And that definitely holds for income, but it also holds for affective rewards. So for the 83% of the people who are in this community feeling like they're part of the community, they really have a very kind of sparse and impoverished community to be part of, because they're not getting the comments and the traffic that is the whole reason they're there in the first place. So, thank you.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Alex Leavitt. I'm a third-year PhD student at USC Annenberg in Los Angeles. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Reddit. So this title is meant to be provocative. I'm going to talk about what has been perceived as the failure of the findbostonbombers subreddit, which became notorious last year, and I'll get into a little bit about what this community did. But there are 3 things that I want to touch on in this talk. The first is to explore ideas about visibility and theories of visibility, and especially this idea of algorithmic publics. Second, to talk about participation in the findbostonbombers subreddit. And then third, to discuss issues of accountability in the creation and maintenance of socio-technical infrastructures. So the Boston bombing occurred last year in April 2013. I'm originally from Boston, so this was really high on my radar at the time. And a few days after the bombing occurred, a community appeared on Reddit.com called our findbostonbombers. And it was created basically to essentially crowdsource information about the incident and potentially identify suspects related to the bombings. Now, it became notorious, of course, because of this incident, where after the police released semi-official photos of the suspects, this pairing was made to a Brown University student, Sunil Tripathi, and that kind of exploded over the course of a few hours. Many mainstream media picked up on this issue, and it basically got out of control and put a lot of pressure on Reddit as a company. However, Reddit as a company decided to close the subreddit a week later, and I just happened to have scraped the subreddit during the Boston bombing process here. And so this talk is going back into exploring the data, using that as an empirical way to talk about these issues and theories around visibility. So first, what I'd like to explore is this idea of an algorithmic public. So essentially, this is an extension of Michael Warner's idea of publics, so a space of discourse that constructs an audience around that discourse. Now, this intersects with Tarleton Gillespie's work on the politics of platforms, and he has this idea of a calculated public. So essentially, a public mediated by technology that essentially presents us ideas of what publics can be. So for example, like Twitter trending topics, which dictates that there are certain publics interested in trending keywords and hashtags. Now, this idea of algorithmic publics is meant to architect a certain kind of public and shape the dynamics of publics via algorithms. And I think that's taking a step back from calculated publics, which I think misses a large portion of the interpretation on the part of the participants as well as observers in these systems. So thinking a little bit about visibility, this is a basic representation of how the algorithm on Reddit works, where there's a certain amount of time after a post is posted where some amount of upvotes and downvotes are given to that post, and at some point throughout a time period, it gains visibility over time. Now, this idea of visibility is pretty crucial both on a technical level and at the social level. So, for example, Duncan Watt's paper from a few years ago, which was an experimental study looking at how social influence might actually affect how people react to certain content. So here, he just shows a basic experimental design which shows that the probability of someone listening to a certain amount of music, if it has things like ratings from people, means that things that are more popular based on those ratings will then get more visibility and listens by the people in the experiment. Now, this also extends to ordinary publics that we deal with every day, like Facebook. There's an interesting study by Michael Bernstein and a few other authors that look at people's perceived audiences on Facebook in relation to the actual number of people that tend to view their posts. And for the large part, people actually underestimate their actual audience on Facebook to a pretty large degree. So there's this issue of the logic of visibility versus viewership versus attention, and I think that this is largely understudied in the social science literature and our theories about the internet and the web. So as far as how Reddit works, so anyone can contribute a URL or a textual post, and then anyone in the community who has an account can either upvote that content, so adding one upvote to the score, or they can downvote the content, so subtracting one from the score. And each score is tabulated into this algorithm that produces visibility for things that get more upvotes and hides things that get less downvotes. Now, there are many algorithms that structure visibility on Reddit, so they have things like the HUT algorithm, or the top algorithm, or the new algorithm, or the controversial algorithm. And so when we think about how Reddit acts as an information hub, there's two ways we can slice it around what kind of information we're trying to deal with. So there's endogenous aspects to this, where we can look at the kind of content that is produced in the system. So for example, for Find Boston Bombers, we have this task where people are trying to identify the bombers, or these other things that are being shared about the events, so news-related postings. And then there are these aspects exogenous to the information. So on the technical level, how the technologies actually architect participation and mediate it, as well as how the community acts as a social filter for these types of behaviors. So in a sense, you have these different ways to cut visibility based on these ways of slicing it. Now, what happens is that while we do have this community that is upvoting and downvoting content and producing visibility in like sharing it with these algorithms, there's also these other dynamics at play, such as moderators. So we have not only this grassroots effort by the community, but also moderators who do this top-down editorialization. Here, we can see from a quote from one of the moderators of the Find Boston Bombing subreddit that visibility isn't just constructed by the community, but also by the moderators. So for example, when talking about the Sunil Tripathi incident, the moderator actually had to go in and delete things throughout the entire night as they were posted to the subreddit. And just for an example of why this is an issue, none of that kind of information is actually given to the community of reddit.com. So if you're interested, you can hit this URL. I did a blog post related to the LA earthquake, and these are all the posts that the moderator deleted after the earthquake occurred in LA in the first 15 minutes. So there are certain information dynamics occurring that are hidden to the community that might actually kind of create more issues around the visibility of certain content and what that actually means. Now, of course, as far as why Sunil Tripathi became an issue, there are many kind of inter and intra dynamics going on here around flows of information between mainstream media and social media and various information sources, whether they're credible ones like the police or not credible ones like Greg Hughes here, who ended up being the first person to tweet about this, which then kind of exploded it across many different types of media channels. But even if the information and source is not credible, this reliance on visibility as truth, which I guess is an extension from the television era and mass media effects, makes this kind of dynamic and understanding why things become popular very complicated. So let's dive quickly into the data. So as I said, I scraped the subreddit before it was put in a private mode. So the data we're working with is about 900 posts and about 25,000 comments across 6,700 users. As far as the content that's contributed to the subreddit, there's many different behaviors at work. Early on in the subreddit, you see many people posting various images that were collected either from mainstream media sites, social media sites, or even from people's individual phones, and then annotating it and trying to do this collaborative work with other people in the community. On the other hand, you have many textual posts that not only contribute to content and discussions, but also highlight these kind of human dynamics behind this very controversial participatory space. So here, a guy who took photos at the site was reflecting on his experience dealing with the emotional aspect of it. As far as looking at users, here's a quick network graph that you can see is particularly spread out. And what this means is, unlike it being very dense and connected, many people who contributed actually were not contributing together very much, or at all. So 50% of people only contributed one message, and surprisingly, about 8% were throwaway accounts. So these temporary accounts where people only post once and were untied to their probably more active Reddit accounts. We can also slice the data by coding it a little bit too. So here, we're again looking at this on-task or off-task dynamic. So if someone was contributing directly to trying to identify the Boston bombers in some way. So those are labeled in purple, and things that are off-topic are in yellow. And you can see that over time, there's this huge swath of yellow that appears at the end. And what we realize is that over time, there was a shift from this kind of task-oriented community to a more breaking news-oriented community, where as a shooting at MIT occurred and this police chase went on through Cambridge and Watertown, the dynamics of what content was put into the community drastically changed. Now here's a complicated graph showing this in a little bit more detail. So let me jump through this real quick. So there are 4 colors here. And they represent different event periods around what kind of information was available to people participating at the time. So blue was at the start of the subreddit where people didn't have much information that was credible. Orange was when the police officially announced that they were looking for a particular suspect in a white hat. Green was when they officially released the photos without names. And then red was this breaking news dynamic that occurred going through Cambridge and Watertown. Now, as far as the individual posts too, those are marked in purple and yellow, again, on task for purple and off task for yellow. And the y-axis is what we have as a controversiality index. So essentially, we take the number of upvotes each piece of content has, minus the number of downvotes, and normalize it over the total number of votes. So things that have a score of 1 are not controversial, and things that have a score of -1 are highly controversial. And you can see that over these time periods, more content is contributed that the community finds to be more controversial, so that things are being more downvoted over time until you hit the swath of the breaking news postings where the controversiality becomes less controversial. So this dynamic around what people are trying to filter within the community and the actual dynamics that we see in the data are particularly interesting. This is just another graph trying to explore this a little bit more, and how the actual community acts as a filter for visibility around particular types of content. So on the y-axis, we have a log scale of upvotes, and on the x-axis, we have a log scale of downvotes. And essentially, you see per post that has a certain number of upvotes, you have a banding effect, where some things get less downvotes, and some things get more. And the things that tend to get less downvotes are things that are more credible. So mainstream media reports, things that are more collaborative and information producing, and things that get more downvotes tend to be things like, gotta delete this subreddit, this whole witch hunt thing is bullshit. Now, what's interesting about this is when we talk about the failure of collaboration and these algorithmically mediated spaces, this idea of collaboration is what we have to kind of challenge. So maybe the things that are downvoted are potentially bad for this community, but maybe not bad in the sense of different publics that could be occurring here and collaborating together. So the counter-publics that are being downvoted by the kind of majority opinion here might actually be important in terms of the collaborative whole of why people should be doing this in the first place. And we see this actually by doing some natural language processing work. So we not only have done qualitative work on this data, and we're starting to do interviews with some of the users, but we've been going into our database and doing some algorithmic work as well. And there are a couple of discourses that emerge from just looking at these kind of trending words that appear in the data set. So things that are highlighted in blue are things that people kind of got hooked on based on things that were popular at the time, so various theories. Things that are highlighted in green are other information that were just happen to be related to the event, like pressure cooker or finish line. Things in yellow are more exploratory frameworks for discussion, and things that are kind of in this void of unfamiliarity with what people are hypothesizing about. So phrasings like looks like or pretty sure. And then red, again, are these counter-publics, disagreement and controversy that the rest of the community was trying to kind of filter against with things that were being filtered into visibility. So finally, to conclude, I think that there's this issue of accountability that we have to take into account when thinking about visibility. So the New York Times posted this interesting article, should Reddit be blamed for the spreading of a smear? And when we revisit visibility in this context, I think we have to think through what the implications, but also the responsibilities of platforms are for spreading information, but also the implications and responsibilities of the collectives and algorithms that mediate those kind of spreading information behaviors. I actually have a paper that I'm presenting next week up in Toronto at CHI, the Computer Human Interaction Conference, where we looked at similar posting and voting dynamics in Hurricane Sandy's subreddit. And one interesting thing that we found is that as the community upvotes certain things, they'll prefer certain types of content. But users who have much more experience on Reddit, who have posted more in their past history, tend to upvote much more different content. So this dynamic between more advanced users and users as the collective are kind of these competing forces that, in addition to this aspect of algorithmic mediation for visibility, the community themselves are having this conflict as well. Now finally, Reddit as a company is also trying to deal with this issue as well. So recently, I mean, of course, they've kind of reflected on the issue as a whole from last year, but recently they've been trying to produce new features that try and prevent or create interventions into dealing with those aspects of accountability and producing information for the community. So here is an example of this new live thread that they've created, which allows a certain small subset of users to kind of curate information from the community as it's contributed, and then produce visibility based on those curators. So to finally conclude, this investigation of the hive mind and groupthink, I think it's particularly interesting to look at this ecosystem of architected visibility. But I really think that moving forward, academia and researchers and artists and whoever really need to think through these ideas of visibility and how we can architect systems that really dive down and help us understand that a little bit better. Thanks. Not full screen?
That's close enough. That'll do.
Can you zoom out a little? If you do 2 fingers down on the mouse pad, it might work.
It's good. Okay, good. Cool. Good. Sweet. Not drawing hard. Okay. We ready? So I'm Willow. Hello.
And I'm Nathan. Who here has ever been to a hackathon or heard about hackathons? Awesome. So often if you read about them in the press, you'll see photos like this, and not so much photos like this. We often see prizes and like cool startups and less communities of different ages learning together.
So some people who show up to these hackathons will say things like they got a lot out of it, they were able to scratch their own itch, they really enjoyed learning things. And people who organize the hackathons often say that they're a learning experience or that they're creating space for people to learn how to engage with their public. So what's going on with this difference?
In our presentation, we're going to share some early results from our research on hackathons, because we're seeing a mismatch between medium narratives and even the narratives of organizers and the stories that participants are telling themselves. And it's a mismatch that matters because it has a direct effect on who shows up, what's possible in these events, and the kinds of funding that ends up getting channeled to them. And we're hoping also to share with you a site we're launching to share the voices of people who participate.
So first, for those who are not familiar with it, what a hackathon is usually focused on some sort of purpose. People gather around that purpose, and it's for a pretty delimited set of time. We interviewed people, about 15, who are organizers, facilitators, participants, sponsors of these events.
And we've also done media analysis of over a year of media coverage in the mainstream media and blogs about hackathons.
Hooray. We also do a whole lot of them. This is one of the groups that I work with that's from the last 2 years.
And that's just Willow.
And in all of this research, what we see is that the actuality of hackathons are around community building and engagement with institutions. I'm going to stand up. I'm not used to sitting down. So this is, I made a timeline. If we look at hackers and hacker spaces and hacker cons, and then also the businesses that are being put together by people that are coming out of those spaces who are a part of the internet being born, and the open source products that they're building. These have all used what are basically hackathons, but they didn't really call them that until the first instances that I can find are in 1999 by both OpenBSD and by Sun Microsystems. And you see this practice being used continually through those open source communities like Debian, as well as in hackerspaces. This is the hackerspace logo. And then there's this huge boom all of a sudden of a bunch of other groups using these, usually around entrepreneurial engagement, open gov, things like this. Cool? Sweet. These are the types of people that might show up to one event. So this is a way of indicating who you want. You don't just want people who are coding, but also people who do front end, and people who are business, and people who do whatever, people who are students.
And people will often come to them, they might have tech skills, but they're not quite sure how to engage with an issue they're passionate about, or they might care about an issue but aren't sure how to link that with technology and design.
And so, what people get out of these events are learning things, showing how their skills can change their environment and how they can have an impact on the world. They can find other people who share that interest that they might not otherwise have overlap with. And they get to see what happens after the event itself. So how do those relationships continue on into the rest of the world after that one weekend?
So we've also been analyzing media coverage of hackathons. So we're using a data set from a project called Media Cloud based at Harvard and the Center for Civic Media, which analyzes over 66,000 media sources in mainstream media and popular blogs. And this is a chart of mentions of hackathons and also mentions of civic hacking from the beginning of 2013 through to March of this year. And we've noticed that like a lot of the coverage, if you move to the next slide, Willow, also done some initial topic modeling, tends to be about startups that are created at hackathons that are corporate events. There's also a little bit of coverage of communities, as well as like areas where there's a media concentration. So there's a whole set of like TechCrunch style articles or articles about New York hackathons. And we can guess that this could be because the startups and the corporations in certain parts of the United States particularly have higher concentration of media or higher access to media in order to get out their message. And there are also a few hackathon articles that address issues of like social good, infosec, and politics. So here are some of the kinds of stories that we've been seeing. One is about kind of solutionism. Like you've got a problem, which is peeing at Mardi Gras, and so what do you need? Airbnb. And what's interesting about this project is that one of the creators of Airbnb has also been praised by the White House for activities in civic hacking and kind of talked a lot about that. This civic hacking area is another area that we've seen a lot of media around, and we were really fascinated looking at the media analysis to see that there were basically three kinds of stories. At the very beginning, there was a moment where the White House blogged about the National Day of Civic Hacking, which happened earlier in 2013. And then there's another bump of a lot of articles about the projects that are created during that day, which is between Q2 and Q3 there. And then kind of there's a longer tail of people asking, what does this all mean? And that's where people start writing critiques of civic hacking and the role that different kinds of making might play in society. And then there's this third type of narrative that we tend to see, which is like this image from the Hack Bus project, where there was a 72-hour hackathon on the bus to South by Southwest in 2013. These narratives about solutionists, technologies, these narratives around civic hacking and the role of hacking in society, and then finally this set of writing about notable individuals that tends to dominate these stories. And there have been a lot of critiques of hackathons coming from both academics, like the Trouble with White Hats article from the New Inquiry, coming from activists themselves, like the National Day of Hacking Assumptions and Entitlement Parody site, which I highly recommend that you look up. Things like Morozov's Making It in the New Yorker, and also critiques coming from funders, like David Sasaki, who wrote a piece on hackathons and solutionism in 2012, and is now, he was in Omidyar, and he's now in the Gates Foundation. And what we've done is we've taken a lot of the major critiques of hackathons, and we've distilled some of the arguments against them that people are making in their blog posts and their media articles.
They usually boil down to free labor for companies and government. So if your purpose is to fix broken things without pay, That makes sense. There's also the produces incomplete and short-lived projects. If you only see it as a one-weekend thing and not as one moment in time in a longer continuum of effort, of course it's going to be a short-lived and incomplete project. As a distraction, people feel good about shiny ideas that never have impact. We see this so much in disaster response hackathons, which can also have good results too. It doesn't create fundamental change. We're just helping people who already understand how government structures work apply their skill sets that they procured through whatever privileged means. And it's a false empowerment. It's solutionism in a weekend. If you just let us have access to this thing for a weekend, we will solve all of your problems with our magic coding wand. It emphasizes superstars rather than communities, getting completely away from its beginnings and ongoing. And it entrenches exclusion by favoring people with technical skills.
So, based on what we've been doing in our interviews, and the stories that people have been telling us, and also just our observations in the media, we think that a lot of these critiques emphasize the things that get portrayed in the media. So the media doesn't emphasize learning. So we haven't seen any critical engagement with the learning goals of hackathons. The media doesn't emphasize the community building piece. And similarly, the critiques don't really address those questions. The media is supporting an overly solutionist narrative, the kind of Airbnb vision of hacking, and that's, it's understandable that critiques would focus on that. And also that media attention tends to be focused around the hackathon event. You'll remember around the National Day of Civic Hacking, there's a huge amount of coverage just in the week or two before and after, but less engagement with the people and stories that are coming out long term. And we think that there's a risk for journalists and media makers, as well as researchers who might just look at these narratives and perhaps spend less time engaged with the communities that are actually involved in this work, to create critiques that are perhaps mismatched to people's actual experiences in hackathons.
So, based on what we've found, we have a responsibility to these working methods for them to continue working well. And so, because these are communities of people coming together around an idea, they are malleable by their very nature, not only because they come out of hackers and hacker spaces, but it's about the participation which shapes the events themselves. So the way we pay attention to them matters. It will directly impact them. They're solid as a working method. We'll continue using these even after they pass as a fad. But in maintaining that they are critical of some structures and that they open up space for new people to interact with institutions that didn't otherwise have a chance, the longer we can hold on to that, the longer it will have impact.
And especially as we have seen these learning outcomes, we have seen really, amazing opportunities for communities of people to come together to critique the structures that surround them and propose alternatives, and do that in conversations with institutions. We think there's also a responsibility for people to be aware of the impact on people that critiques of hackathons have, as well as media coverage of hackathons, to either unhelpfully emphasize superstars or unhelpfully critique things that are these media effects. So we have some advice for different people who are engaging with hackathons.
So if you're organizing a hackathon, be sure that you're portraying it correctly to all parties involved, and to amplify the front-loading and after effects, to paying more attention to those. And if you're reporting on a hackathon, talk about the whole story. And if you're researching hacker culture, try to talk to the people that are in that culture. That clearly doesn't involve people in this room, but in general, it's a request.
And kind of towards that, Willow and I and a bunch of other people are creating hackathonfaq.com. How would you describe that, Willow?
So it's the interviews that were taken for this study that have then been curated by the people that were interviewed, so that they're sure that their points are getting across. And then those are up there for you to read as well. And there are also essentially op-eds of who is welcome at a hackathon or who's not welcome at a hackathon, and how you can tell who, through the language, who they're being inclusive of, do they have childcare, things like this, both as a cautionary tale to attendees, but also as guidance for the people who are organizing.
You know, we've taken a bunch of questions like that one on inclusion, questions on lasting impact, questions on how do you make media about hackathons. And we've pointed out to the voices within this practice in communities who are sharing their experiences and their best practices. You know, who are the people who've written great blog posts about how to highlight community and how to highlight learning in the media that you create? Who are the people who are really good at talking about how to create lasting impact and how to foster community? And we welcome anyone here who's involved in that as a working method to get in touch and help improve that community resource.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, so we started a couple minutes late, so we're running a couple minutes behind. But Rachel Binx has been hash modding for us. Do you want to take a couple minutes and do a review?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of people in this room that have been live blogging, so there's a pretty good record of what has been going on in these different talks. There's only a couple of questions, but one of them is for Laura. This is from Meetspace, and it says, so in food blogging, does posting a picture while failing to share a recipe set up meals as positional goods?
Most people don't post only pictures. They may not post recipes. I mean, especially if they're a review blogger, for instance. Can you define positional goods? I don't know how to answer that.
So positional goods being goods whose values are derived primarily in the ways that they provide status. So if you hold back the recipe and only provide the picture, are you creating food blogging as this thing that provides status rather than sharing recipes that all can enjoy?
That there is probably some of that, because the photography and then the high quality writing, so it's not just the pictures. But definitely provide this conduit for displaying sort of high class background, which is where I think that educational component comes through. If you can't do that, if you don't have those skills, you will fall out of the community. And if you don't sort of buy into that type of status thing, you also maybe just drop like the woman who was like, I got that email and then I quit. So yes, I guess the answer is yes, but that's how.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general there is sort of a thread of the privilege that is sort of going on between these different talks, in both like, you know, access to cameras and proper lighting and food blogging, and having sort of opinions that are more upvoted on Reddit, and the people who are able to participate in hackathons.
Yeah, kind of as an addendum to that, something that kept going through my head was, you know, was this question of political economy, which was really, you know, absolutely undergirding, I think, all of the different talks, but didn't really get brought out to the surface all that much. You know, there's all these kind of affective economies that are circulating in all of the different presentations, right? And these kind of these feedback loops of economy and emotion, right? That are these strangely temporal, right? Kind of odd temporality. So I don't know if that's sort of like to piggyback on that question. If anybody wanted to, if that's something that anybody thought about, and then maybe we're really running out of time here, so maybe we'll take one or two questions from the audience after. So I don't know if any of you want to address that.
Let's go.
Okay.
Oh, I'm Lisa Nakamura. Thank you for these papers. They're really interesting. Should I talk into the mic so people can hear me about that?
I didn't hear what you said, so possibly.
Okay. Hi. Is this the microphone?
Yep.
This is a speaker. It's behind me. Oh, all right. Hi, I'm Lisa Nakamura. Thanks for these papers. They're really interesting. And my question was for the first two, because those are often the ones that get forgotten because people's memories work that way. And so it was a question that came up listening to Alex's gesture towards theory, because that's where this is going, right? Data has to mean something. And so the ethics of upvoting seems very much to be about what Dara's talking about. When you were showing these images, and talking about how you didn't want to circulate them because they're actually toxic, harmful images, right? That you could become someone who is perpetuating the victimization of people, and how the Reddit upvote is in some ways the same thing, right? So when a scholar shows an image like that, you're upvoting it in some way. It's something I want to interrogate, because as scholars, we have to be able to show things in order to critique them. There's no other way to do it.
To be honest, I did not think about it until the question came to me. And as I mentioned, it's something I was unsettled by, because part of the privilege that I exert by writing about race, particularly anti-Black vigilantism and so on, there's a certain privilege that I'm taking in looking at the way people are punishing Black bodies. And so I'll write about it, publish pictures and so on, without thinking about myself as a privileged author, because I'm looking at this as part of the work that I do around social justice and my race community. And so when someone asked me that question, it put me in a different sort of space of thinking about my own privilege and myself as an author that I hadn't done before. And I need a little bit of space to think about that, because there is the work, the images are grotesque and they're brutal, and I have about 5,000 sitting on my computer. If anything were to happen to me, somebody just explode my computer, because it's just filled with really just graphic images that need a lot of contextual work around it. When people are seeking social control, when they're in an environment where they don't feel a sense of law there, a rule of law there to protect them, they act accordingly. And what we're seeing online is this vigilante space that tends to come around when a society exists and is now moving into its teenage life. So they're teenage mid-20s, like I'm now past that sort of wild partying thing, and I'm now trying to get settled and own property and think about the future. And now I need some rules and regulations. And when those rules and regulations don't exist out there in terms of being prescribed by the state, what happens when we write them ourselves? And that's what we're seeing online. And I'm not sure right now if I'm comfortable publishing things without first working out a clear theoretical understanding of what that means and where we are in this Digilante context. And that's kind of why I pulled back on putting them out there, because, and now that I didn't get to say everything that I wanted to, I definitely think I made the right call, because that framing isn't there to help people make sense of what a Digilante culture means for our world offline as well.
So we've got, do you want to respond to that as well? I mean, part of that question was addressed to you. But
all I would say is that I think that there's interesting kind of underlying tension there, in that like the concept of the upvote has politics in it, and that even in the way that Reddit describes how visibility is produced, it's under the assumption that it's for the promotion of discussion. And yet, when you go talk to users, it's all about, oh, I just like this. Oh, like I hated that. That's why I downloaded it. And I think the same kind of politics come into both like from an academic standpoint, but also on like a very personal level as academics. Mm-hmm. And so like the politics behind our choices in making things visible, I think, is really the key, rather than just the act of making it visible in the first place.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time, which too bad. So hopefully, we'll be able to talk to you guys a little more after the panel. But otherwise, thank you very much for coming, and